Whenever we search for information, we're not just encountering facts and raw data. We're also interacting with the people who are creating and disseminating that information. With that comes their different perspectives and sometimes even their hidden assumptions. Within certain contexts, inherent or systemic biases may privilege some sources of information over others. This means that some voices may be amplified while others are overlooked. It is our job not just to collect information, but to think critically about where that information comes from and which perspectives are being represented while others are missing. Recognizing bias allows us to develop this kind of mindset and helps us understand the lens through which a source is created. So what exactly is bias? As defined by Oxford Languages, bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered to be unfair. The ability to recognize bias is essential. Unchecked bias can fuel misinformation and limit our ability to understand diverse perspectives. Identifying bias can be tricky, especially because it comes in so many forms, including explicit bias, implicit bias, confirmation bias, sampling or selection bias, or conflicts of interest. Let's take a closer look at each of these. Explicit bias is a conscious belief, feeling, or behavior which expresses hostility towards other groups and feelings of superiority to one's own group. People with explicit bias are not ashamed to admit these beliefs. Explicit bias may look like hate speech and harassment, hiring discrimination, or even refusal of medical care. On the other hand, implicit bias is unconscious and automatic. People with implicit bias may not admit to or even be aware of the biases that they have towards a group, but this type of bias still results in unfair treatment or disrespect of the other group. Implicit bias tends to stem from cultural or societal norms. Implicit bias might look like a teacher calling on boys more often than girls, someone choosing a seat closer to someone of their own race, or assuming the gender of someone in a certain profession, like expecting a teacher to be a woman or a doctor to be a man. It can be difficult to tell the difference between explicit and implicit bias because the outcomes of biased behavior are essentially the same whether the behavior was intentional or not. Confirmation bias is particularly important to be aware of when doing research. This type of bias involves the favoring of information that aligns with pre-existing beliefs. This might look like choosing sources that align with your beliefs regardless of their validity, dismissing views that are different from your own, or not seeking out multiple points of view on a topic. Another form of bias to look out for in research is sampling or selection bias. This type of bias occurs in research studies when the sample being studied does not accurately represent the characteristics of the larger population it was taken from. There are many subcategories of sampling bias. For example, survivorship bias, in which samples only include survivors of a process, thereby only focusing on successful outcomes in a scenario. Or convenience sampling bias, in which researchers select participants based on their easy accessibility rather than their representation of a population. A conflict of interest is a type of bias that occurs when someone has multiple conflicting interests. In relation to information, a conflict of interest may occur when an information creator stands to benefit in some way, usually financially, from the dissemination of information. A conflict of interest might look like a pharmaceutical company publishing clinical research on a drug they sell, an influencer posting a review for a product they're being paid to use or were given for free, or a politician gaining financially from a policy or regulation. As you can see, bias can take many forms. Sometimes it's obvious, other times it's subtle, and often it's part of a larger system that shapes the information we encounter. The most important thing to remember is that even though we cannot completely avoid bias, we can learn to recognize and account for it. In the next video, we'll look at some of the different methods we can use for evaluating information sources. Want some help? Schedule a research appointment with one of our librarians today.